É um prazer e uma honra conduzir a mesa sobre o futuro dos BRICS com tão distintos convidados. Teremos tradução simultânea durante todo o evento. As perguntas podem ser colocadas em português no chat. E, tendo dado as minhas boas-vindas a todos em português, eu peço licença aos que nos assistem para mudar para inglês. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Is There a Future for BRICS? This event will launch the book, The BRICS and the Financing Mechanism Created by Them, written by Dr. Paulo Nogueira Batista Jr. The webinar is supported by Celso Furtado and CartaCapital. Thank you very much. So my name is Lavinia de Castro. I have been working and studying development banks for the last 20 years and teaching the Brazilian economy. So it's my pleasure and honor to be here to mediate this webinar today. This event is part of a Celso Furtado chair from the Colégio de Altos Estudos da UFRJ. And I was considering, it seems that it's indeed appropriate to a Celso Furtado chair the discussion about the BRICS. Professor Celso Furtado used it to say, Brazil has enriched, developed, but maintained its subordination to the great sense, to decisions negotiated outside the country. Well, isn't the BRICS dream all about it? I mean, the five large original countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, was dissatisfied with how the Bretton Woods institutions were working and their failure to catch up with the balance of economic and political power changes at the beginning of the 21st century. As the writer of the book says, by that time, the BRICS were not only the world's five major emerging economies with significant influence on international affairs and economic cooperation among emerging countries in general, but they also had a low dependency on external capital from the US or Europe. They also had a strong balance of payment positions with a high level of international reserves, okay, with the occasional exception of South Africa, but also the BRICS by that time, maybe things changed today, I'm afraid, were not confrontational. So an ample opportunity was just there in front of us, waiting to be caught. Why not be ambitious and try to update the global financial architecture? This is how the story begins. In 2014, after several years of internal discussion, the BRICS countries established two major multilateral mechanisms of their own, the BRICS Contingent Reserve Arrangement, CRA, and the New Development Bank, NDB, of which Nogueira Batista co-founded. But of course, life is more complicated than it seems. So this amazing book talks precisely about how hard it is to make fundamental institutional changes, how to convince your own bureaucrats to innovate, to do something different, take and share risk, how to establish the delicate balance of power among the countries, how to share responsibilities. In some sense, this book tells a story that could be in some way disappointing in a Celso Furtado's view, since fundamental change did not happen. But at the Colégio de Altos Estudos, we are optimistic. So, as Professor Ana Célia Castro likes to say, we can't change the past, but the future is here to be built. So, after this short introduction, it's time to ask, is there a future for the BRICS? I now invite Professor Paulo Nogueira Batista Jr. to answer the question and talk about the book. Paulo Nogueira Batista is a well-known Brazilian economist. He was the executive director representing Brazil and other countries at the International Monetary Fund from 2007 to 2015. He was vice president of New Development Bank from 2015 to 2017. I kindly ask you to talk 15 minutes. And as in BRICS arrangement, where the founding members are always guaranteed to have a collective majority vote share, the same vote share, I will give the same time for the other two guests. So I will be delighted to listen to Professor Robert Wade, 15 minutes comments. Dr. Robert Wade has been a professor of political economy at the London School of Economics since 2001. He has a vast academic curriculum, including Princeton University, MIT, Brown University, Institute of Development Studies, Sussex University, the World Bank, the US Congress. He was the winner of the Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought 2008. And last but not least, I invite Professor Aleksei Mozhin to make his comments. He was an IMF executive director representing Russia and a dean of the IMF Executive Board, head of the Department for Interaction with International Financial Institutions at the Russian government, and a senior economist at several research institutions. I will be collecting questions in English and in Portuguese, so please use the Q&A box in your Zoom menu or give us in the in the YouTube, and the questions will be sent to me. And please give your name and affiliation when you do so. So thank you very much. Professor Paulo, please, the floor is yours.
Ué, me tiraram de tradutor, você não? Ah, bom.
Thank you. Thank you, Lavínia. Do we have an interference here?
I think it's okay now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Yes. Okay, so thank you very much, Lavínia, and I would like first of all to thank Robert Wade and Aleksei Mozhin for accepting our invitation to be present here as panelists in today's debate. This is really a very special privilege that we have here to have both of them here with us. Robert Wade, as Lavínia said, is one of the main specialists in international economic matters. He has been making very important contributions to the academic literature on international economic issues since the 1990s, at least, if not before. And Aleksei Mozhin is the Russian executive director in the board of the IMF. And he has been in the board of the IMF since the early 1990s. And being the longest serving executive director, and he is also the president, the chairman of the board of the executive board of the IMF. And I think it's fair to say that Alexei is perhaps the person who knows more about the International Monetary Fund in the entire world, because he's been there in an active role, in a role of responsibility for now, 30 years. And that's quite a lot. Huh? And also Alexei, I should mention, was the person who initiated the BRICS coordination in the IMF executive board. In 2008, when the BRICS began, at the initiative of Russia, I must mention, Alexei approached the Brazilian executive director, I was the one at the time, the Chinese executive director, the Indian executive director, and proposed that we coordinate. And we accepted Russia's invitation and started coordinating. The same movement was done in the capitals of the BRICS by officials of the finance ministry, foreign ministry of Russia, who reached out to Brazil, India, and China, and the BRICS began. South Africa later would join in 2011. But I would like to make this short presentation a forward-looking presentation in line with the title of our session today. Do the BRICS have a future? Actually, I addressed this question in the last chapter of the book that I just published with Anthem Press, which is called The BRICS and the Financing Mechanisms They Created, mentioned by Lavínia. And I should start by saying that there's a lot of skepticism about the BRICS in the world. And this skepticism was there in the beginning when we first started working together in 2008. It receded very much in the heyday of BRICS Corporation, which was between 2008 and 2014. But the skepticism has resurfaced now. And if you look, for example, Robert, you must have noticed this, the creator of the acronym BRICS, Jim O'Neill, has more recently become a very strong BRICS pessimist, has been very negative about the BRICS as a formation. In fact, I think this pessimism about the BRICS must be taken with a grain of salt, because it is largely represented in the North Atlantic community, Europe and North America, United States. There's a North Atlantic bias against the BRICS, which is understandable because the BRICS constitute the main challenge to the North Atlantic axis since the Second World War, I would say. The BRICS, or more specifically China, but the BRICS as part of this. No? Perhaps I don't want to put it too strongly, but perhaps we could speak of an information war carried out by the Western powers, led by the United States, that affects the way the media and even the universities in the West look at the BRICS that we are going to discuss today. Perhaps information war is too strong a word. I borrowed it from my Russian friends. The Russians are always at pains to stress that there's an information war going on, and we should be alert to that fact. Now, you see, the BRICS acronym was created in 2001 by Jim O'Neill, an economist with Goldman Sachs. But the BRICS as a political reality only came into being about 7 years later, as I said, in 2008 at the Russian initiative. Skepticism about the BRICS was, as I said, there from the beginning and has become very strong more recently, including in my country, in Brazil, I should stress, since the Temer administration, Michel Temer administration, especially with Jair Bolsonaro's government as of 2019. Many people thought that Brazil would even leave the BRICS, something that did not happen, fortunately. But the fact is that Brazil has become much less prominent in the BRICS than it used to be. And this has been reflected in a skepticism about the BRICS in Brazil. I do not agree with this skepticism, as I explain in my book, but I do recognize that it has some basis in reality. For example, the conflicts between India and China, poor relations between two of the 5 countries of the BRICS, that's a factor. Second, China is becoming too big, too important. And this has made the BRICS an even more unbalanced formation than it used to be when Alexei started off contacting us in 2008 in the IMF Executive Board. Number 3, Russia is handicapped to some... Can you hear me?
Yes.
Russia is handicapped to some extent by the sanctions imposed by the West since the 2014 Ukraine-Crimea crisis. And Brazil has lost momentum, did not leave the BRICS as many feared, but it's undoubtable that Brazilian participation in the BRICS lost drive and content in recent years. However, as I try to explain in the book, these macro political factors had a negative impact, not only in the BRICS formation as a whole, but also on the financing mechanisms that BRICS created. Those that were mentioned by Lavinia in her introduction, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement and the New Development Bank. The Contingent Reserve Arrangement is the monetary fund of the BRICS, and the New Development Bank, the NDB, is the development bank that the BRICS created. Of course, with these political problems that I briefly mentioned here, it was inevitable that our initiatives on the financial field would be negatively affected. But there were also, I'd like to stress this, some micro factors or institution-specific problems that hampered both the CRA, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, and the New Development Bank, the NDB. The CRA, as I explained in the book, was hampered from the very beginning by the conservatism of the central banks of the BRICS, especially of the Brazilian central bank, perhaps. And this conservatism is quite important to explain why the CRA did not move further than it could have, because being a monetary institution, it was natural that the central banks of the countries play the decisive role in the monetary fund of the BRICS. Now, the New Development Bank was held back by poor choices for the bank's administration, as I also try to explain in the book. This, I make some rather harsh comments about some of my former colleagues in the book, and some of the readers thought that this was excessively ad hominem. But I'd like to explain that when I say that the Indian president, the first Indian president of the New Development Bank, and his Brazilian successor since 2020, when I say that there were glaring weaknesses of most of the VPs, this vice president, especially the Russian and the South African vice presidents, I'm pointing to a fact that is very important in institution building. When you start from scratch, constituting a development bank from zero, the personal qualities or lack thereof of the administration are crucial, more so than they would be in an already long established institution. So it is a wonder to me, really a wonder to me, why the Russian and Indian representatives, for instance, in the New Development Bank were so weak, considering that in the IMF, the Russian and Indian executive directors, as well as their teams, were very strong, among the best in the institution. I always say this publicly. I wrote it in the book as well. I'm not saying this because Aleksei Mozhin is here with us today. It's something that really struck me as a contrast that I did not understand. Anyway, having said all that, I have reasons to believe that we do have a future as a group. And for many reasons, I don't want to speak too much, but briefly, the factors that brought the BRICS together back in 2008 are largely still there. A point I make in the book, and that Aleksei Mozhin himself always stresses. The BRICS are large emerging market countries whose views, they rightly feel, are not sufficiently taken into account in the current international financial architecture. We are underrepresented, remain so despite some progress in the IMF and the World Bank. So that's number one. Number two, India and China, since 2020, there were border scuffles, quite serious, with casualties on both sides, but it seemed that there has been some improvement. We know that the United States always tries to use the conflicts between India and China in its favor to isolate China. But anyway, I believe, I hope I'm not wrong, that there has been an improvement, a slight improvement at least, in India-China relations in the recent past, in the very recent past. Number three, China. China is of course very large and becoming larger, but China's interest in the BRICS has increased with the worsening of US-China relations since Trump, but also continuing during the Biden administration. I think the same comment applies mutatis mutandis to Russia after the 2014 crisis over Ukraine and Crimea. Russia also has a special interest in the BRICS. And Brazil, the weak spot, may well cease to be a weak spot in the BRICS, depending on next year's election results. If former President Lula becomes president again as of 2023, I believe Brazil will recover its previous strong and active role in the BRICS formation. South Africa retains a very strong interest in BRICS cooperation. It is one of the most important countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and it values BRICS as a special sign of its international importance. And the NDB and the CRA, despite of what I have just said and wrote in the book, I must say that a lot has been achieved. I have no time to explain what has been achieved exactly. I refer you to the book. But both the NDB and the CRA have been created. They are established, technically well advanced on several points, and I believe they are ready to be restarted once the political drive is given to them by the BRICS political leaders. However, a final point that I want to make, I make in the book, and that needs to be stressed, I believe. It is important to make the distinction between alliance and cooperation mechanism. The BRICS are not, in my view, and were never meant to be, a full-fledged political alliance for wide-ranging purposes. It is not comparable to the European Union, for example, even to the G7 in the heyday of the G7. It is a cooperation mechanism, important, but for limited purposes. This may seem, perhaps to you, a mere conceptual precision, a fine point of language or something of the sort, but I believe it is more than that. It is actually quite crucial to the matter that we are discussing today. Finally, the stance that I took in the book and in this presentation today is a critical and I hope realistic view of the BRICS and what we have achieved, but it is also, I hope, a positive and forward-looking view of the BRICS, of its achievement and of its future. A final quote on Churchill. I like very much, Robert. You know, Churchill's definition of success, which is success is stumbling from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm. Thank you. I hand back the floor to you, Lavinia.
Thank you very much. Great praise. Well, I will just give the floor to Professor Habathwaite, please. Just continue.
Okay, give me warning at 13 minutes. So I want to begin by saying that Paulo's book makes, even though it's only 70 pages long, makes a quite distinctive contribution to our literature on the internal functioning of international organizations, interstate organizations. It contributes in particular to what Anna Celia likes to call the underwear politics of these organizations. And to make my point, I want to hold up these two enormous volumes. These two volumes are the history of the World Bank, and they run together to 2,000 pages. I've spent some time looking through these 2,000 pages, and in fact, my chapter in the second volume is about 120 pages. And my guess is that Paulo's 70 pages contributes as much as these 2,000 pages do to our understanding of the underwear politics of one type of international organization. The history of the World Bank's 2,000 pages are quite remarkable for how little they contribute to our knowledge of the underwear politics. So I want to focus my remarks on upstream of the BRICS, that is on points which indicate why it is that we need groups such as the BRICS in the current condition of the world economy and the world polity. And my first point, the first reason why we need such relatively small groups is this, that the functioning of universal or near universal multilateral bodies, multilateral agreements, has become over the past 2 decades more and more difficult, less effective than in earlier periods, and for 2 reasons in particular. One is that there have been big changes in the past 2 decades in the relative power of states up near the top of the world hierarchy. And the second and more important reason is that there have been big differences, disagreements between these states up at the top that are now at the top of the world hierarchy, disagreements in values, in their preferences for global rules. And because of these disagreements, these large organizations, large N organizations, near universal interstate bodies are becoming less and less effective. And the other side of that is that smaller and like-minded groups meeting to collaborate, to cooperate, as Paulo said, amongst themselves, and then in the formulation of values, in the formulation of rules, and then trying to extend their conclusions out towards others. These smaller and like-minded groups have become, at least potentially, relatively more effective than in the past, as the effectiveness of the big multilateral groups declines. And so in that context, the BRICS group of just 5, as small as 5 leading developing country states and spanning multiple regions, looks to be promising. And the second reason why we need groups like the BRICS is this, and Paulo touched on it, that is, the West has been long coordinated by the US state, boosted by the wider G7 set of Western states, North Atlantic states, plus Japan, whereas the South has lacked any such collaborating body. And yet, the existing structure of the world economy, and in particular, the existing structure of governance in the existing multilateral bodies like the IMF and the World Bank, these structures are configured to work strongly to the advantage of the West. And one main indicator of this point is the shocking lack of catch-up in income and wealth of non-Western countries over the past 7 decades. The West has very much set the rules. And just to give you a quote which brings out this very starkly and shockingly. This quote comes from Mickey Cantor, who is the former US trade representative and who said in the late 1990s, after the so-called East Asian financial crisis, he said, quote, "The troubles of the tiger economies," meaning the Northeast Asian economies, "the troubles of the tiger economies offered a golden opportunity for the West to reassert its commercial interests." And he went on to say, "When countries seek help from the IMF, Europe and America should use the IMF as a battering ram to gain advantage." So this encapsulates very well the spirit of the US, but also the spirit of the G7 in how they interact with countries of the South. And just to amplify that, in the year 2000, my friend Jomo, the Malaysian economist, was standing talking to David Lipton, who was the US Treasury's point man in the Asian crisis on the ground in South Korea and the other crisis countries, and telling the IMF, so he was in the US Treasury, he was telling the IMF what the IMF should be telling to the crisis affected countries. So my friend Jomo asked him, why did you, the US Treasury and the IMF, insist on such far-reaching conditions on the part of the crisis-affected countries, conditions that were quite unrelated to them getting out of the crisis, quite contrary to the mandate of the IMF? And David Lipton said to him in a very nonchalant, matter-of-fact way, quote, "If we can't get them when they're down, we'll never get them." And so the larger point is that the rules of the development game have been set very largely by the West. And in that context, there is a clear need for more concerted action, more cooperation on the part of leading countries in the South. And in particular to, in a sense, balance the G7. Remember that the G7 have also been steering the G20. So the G20 has become something of an instrument. To the extent that the G20 does anything at all, it's been something of an instrument by which, even though there are many developing countries in it, the West has been able to extend its influence sort of behind the screen. So let me go on and just elaborate this point about how little catch-up there has been. And I refer to a very shocking study by Yilmaz Akgüz. Yilmaz Akgüz was the former top economist of UNCTAD, and he not long ago made a striking calculation about the links between the two block structure of the world economy, that is the Western bloc on top and the rest of the world in the second block. And the question is why there has been so little catch-up of the South to the Western bloc. And so Yilmaz found that over the period 2000 to 2016, so a period of 16 years in this century, the 9 emerging economies in the G20, so that includes all the ones in the BRICS, the 9 emerging economies in the G20 transferred an average of 2.3% of their combined GDP per year to advanced countries, and those advanced countries were mostly the US, Japan, Germany, and the UK. 2.3% of their combined GDP per year to the advanced countries. And in the year 2016, they transferred 2.7%. And then there's a question of how this transfer occurs. Much of it occurs through the fact that developing countries have to maintain large foreign exchange reserves invested in low-yielding assets such as US treasuries. And in return, they pay out to Western firms, Western governments, high-yielding returns on their own liabilities. And so this is one channel by which this enormous transfer of resources occurs, but it's just one channel. And it helps to explain why it is that the Southern Bloc has, over the past 7 decades, the so-called development decades, has caught up in terms of income and wealth, medium income, average income, so little to that of the North. And this, again, underlines the point that of the need for much more concerted action by developing countries to reform the conditions in which they integrate into the world economy, to reform the conditions in which they integrate, most likely against the wishes of the West. The reason being that the West finds this two-block structure of the world economy, the world polity, quite satisfactory. Thank you very much. So that's the context in which one can argue that there is a very strong need for the BRICS to come together. And I finish just by saying that I very much hope that Paulo is right in seeing, at least potentially, a fairly rosy future for the BRICS once the politics change, once, for example, people like Bolsonaro and Donald Trump are no longer in power. So thanks very much.
I'm having an easy job, so everyone is respecting time and answering first. So please, Dr. Aleksei Mozhin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lavinia. I hope you can hear me. Please confirm. You do.
Yes.
I'm never sure. But let me begin by congratulating Paulo Nogueira Batista and the publisher of this book. I think this book is very important because it is describing the very recent and important developments by somebody who has been a direct participant in these events. Obviously, not everybody will agree with each and every sentence of the book, which is normal. But nonetheless, I think it is a very important and timely book. So my congratulations. I am also very glad to be on this panel. I'm glad to see Paulo. I think we have not seen each other for like 5 years. Last time we met, I believe, in 2016 in Shanghai, when Paulo was still with the New Development Bank in Shanghai. And I am also very glad, I was very happy to listen to Mr. Wade and his very thoughtful comments. Now on the BRICS, of course, as was mentioned has already been mentioned, we were married by Goldman Sachs. And it is this famous publication by Jim O'Neill in 2001, when this acronym, the BRIC, was invented. But the real birth of the BRICS was certainly in 2009. And it was in the G20 summit in Pittsburgh in the United States. I think it was September 2009. This was the first summit of the Barack Obama presidency, and Americans who were hosting this summit, they very much wanted to achieve something, to achieve what is called a deliverable in this summit slang. And the main topic of the meeting was the IMF quota reform. And what happened was that as it is always the case, the meeting started by the meeting of G20 deputies, meaning to be G20 deputy finance ministers and central bank governors. But in my case, I was delegated to sit in this chair for my deputy, because the deputy was on the same plight with the president. All deputies like to be with the presidents, as we all know. And Paulo was also sitting in the Brazilian chair. Our Indian and Chinese colleagues, the IMF board members, our direct colleagues, were not present even in this meeting. So what happened was that in the first meeting, we spent like the whole day and made no progress at all on the quota reform of the IMF. And we agreed to meet again next day, early in the day, maybe 9 o'clock, if I'm not mistaken. And when we started this second meeting at 9 o'clock the next day, it immediately became clear that nobody, none of the delegations moved from their entrenched positions an inch. And so the chair of the meeting, which was the US deputy, and by the way, this was Lyle Brainerd, who is number 2 in the US Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. She was then the US deputy chairing this meeting. She said, okay, we're not making any progress at all. So why don't we interrupt and you all go and walk in the corridor, and we will try to approach you individually, one-on-one. So the whole meeting was interrupted, and we went into the corridor and started to walk around and thinking, what do we do? And of course, me and Paulo, we got together because we knew each other, being the colleagues on the IMF board. And then we thought, what do we do? And we decided, okay, why don't we get together with China and India and try to discuss this in the format of the 4. So we found an empty room, went there, and then we invited the Chinese and Indian delegations to join us. And by the way, the Chinese delegation was headed by Yi Gang, who is now the president of the People's Bank of China, the Chinese central bank. And we sat together and started to discuss how do we make progress. And for the next, and the Europeans saw that, so that they did roughly the same thing. They found an empty room, gathered there in this room, and for the next 7 hours, we've been discussing one single sentence in the G20 communique. the sentence on the IMF quarters. And Lyle Brainerd, who was the chair of deputies, she was doing the shuttle diplomacy between one room where we sat and the other room where the Europeans were sitting. And the outcome of this 7-hour shuttle diplomacy was a very long and convoluted sentence, which was impossible to understand. but nonetheless, the number 3% shift was mentioned in this sentence, although it was entirely not clear from whom to whom. And what did it mean? It was, as I said, very intentionally convoluted and difficult to understand sentence. So this was the birth of the BRICS. And of course, and then we started, when we returned to Washington, to the IMF board, we started to get together on a regular basis. And this was enjoyable to all of us, because we knew from all our previous experience that whatever we say individually in the IMF executive board did not matter, was entirely and completely ignored by the majority, which was controlling the board. And all of a sudden we found that if we are able to agree on something, which was not easy very often because we could have different interests, different views, but if we were able to agree on something, we were capable of make an impact. And this was, of course, the golden age on the BRICS, especially after South Africa joined in 2011. It has become known to the IMF staff, those who were preparing board meetings, that unless they make the BRICS agree on something, nothing can happen. Nothing can happen. This was a golden age. It was a novelty to all of us. It was a novelty that we could matter, that we could not sit in the IMF board as a mere decoration, just playing the role, making the IMF able to say that we are the global institution with the global membership, but we knew we were completely ignored individually. But this was no longer the case after the emergence of the BRICS. Now, this is all history. I will try to follow Paulo's suggestion and try to look forward. I mean, first of all, there was a skepticism, wide skepticism, especially in the Western English language press about the BRICS. It had always been pointed out that these are 4 and later 5 very different countries. Nothing was uniting these countries. That China and India were historical rivals. Paulo mentioned the border conflict in 2020, but they were geopolitical rivals for many centuries. In fact, the 2 largest countries in the region. Brazil was far away, and nobody knew what was going on in Brazil. And everybody knew, of course, Pelé and the Brazilian football team, but not much more. So there was this arguments, skeptical arguments that this was something not serious. I think the question which I had to answer quite frequently is, how would I describe the BRICS? Is it a bloc? Is it an alliance? And as Paulo described, of course it is not. I think the best word to describe the BRICS is that it is a club. It is a club where club members enjoy being members of this club. They enjoy the opportunity to sit down together, to exchange views. Sometimes they can agree, sometimes not. But I think that all the five continue to enjoy membership in this club. And that's what I can see on my own experience. I remain the member of the IMF Executive Board. I'm the Dean of the Executive Board. And we continue to hold our BRICS meetings, despite all the changes that happened. Now, what has happened? Obviously, there are ups and downs in this relationship. Paulo mentioned some factors which played a role. I think the main thing which has led to somewhat less active participation and less active role of the BRICS is the geopolitical conflict between the United States on one hand and Russia and China on the other hand. So what we have now is that Russia and China are in a grave and escalating conflict with the United States, perhaps an existential conflict, while Brazil and India remain on a much more friendly relations with Washington. This is dividing us. This is the obvious reason. But looking to the future, I think what is the key, what will continue to unite these five large economies is their role in the international institutions. As was mentioned by Professor Wade also, that the only chance for us not to be ignored is to stick together. The IMF distribution of quotas remains very unfair. The voting power in the board of the IMF and the World Bank is 60-40. 60 the rich economies and 40 the rest of the world. While even if we apply the current formula, which is a very flawed formula for determining these quotas, this will give you the proportion something like 50-50, close to 50-50. But the actual quotas and voting power remains to be 60-40, which means that it is this situation has not changed. The rich world is continuing to take decisions, sometimes very wrong decisions, and make everybody else pay for the decisions they make. As an example, the decision to lend the former Argentine government $45 billion, which were all spent on bailing out the private financial sector crooks. I mean, it was a crime because this is burdened the nation of Argentina with an unpayable, unsustainable, and unrestructurable debt, which this Argentine nation will have to deal with at least until the end of this decade. So they made a decision and made all of us pay for that because we are all participate in what is called the financial transaction plan of the IMF, where we pay for the decisions taken by the IMF board. We participate with our money to finance in financing the IMF loans. So this situation remains the same as it was, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And this is the main factor which I am sure will continue to unite the BRICS countries. Thank you, Lavinia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alexei. Well, I was considering here, we have like 2 questions, and but it seems that one of them is more like related to what you just said, which is so interesting in terms of the conflicts we have now, which make more delicate the position and the risk that we are not so much together and on the same page. And so in some sense, I think this question is better to introduce, and then if Paulo wants to comment first, is what will be the most important objectives to keep BRICS together as a political group in the near future? I think we can listen from all of you a little bit and then move to the next question.
I also have
Lavinia, I don't want to speak at length now because I think we need to get the questions from the public. But I'd just like to make one brief comment on the story, that very interesting story that Aleksei Mozhin just told us about the Pittsburgh G20 summit in 2019. Indeed, this was perhaps the first time when we acted jointly with a concrete result as BRICS in the G20 context. But one thing he doesn't remember, perhaps, but I told him at the time, the BRICS were not fully recognized as a grouping at the time. And Lael Brainerd, the lady he mentioned, who was then deputy finance minister for the G20, and who's now number 2 in the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of the United States, Lael Brainerd, came to me and to the Indian and Chinese representatives and told us, look, we would like you to get together and perhaps help me reach an agreement, but we don't want Russia with you. Mm. The US tried to exclude Russia from our group. And we had already started working together in the IMF board at the initiative of Russia since 2008, as I mentioned in the beginning. So I told Lael, and I was supported in this by the Indian and the Chinese representative, no, Russia has to be here. So Alexei was brought in. We all the time we worked together, the 4 of us. Alexei for Russia, I for Brazil, and the Indian and Chinese representatives. So you see, the problem between US and Russia has been intensified, especially since the 2014 Ukraine-Crimea crisis, but it was there already. It was there already before. And but I won't add anything more because Alexei was very, very successful in presenting what are the main difficulties for the BRICS going forward. And he was very, very succinct and to the point there. So I just stop here and return the floor.
If I may just add, Paulo, you said in 2019, this was a misspeak. 2009, Pittsburgh Summit was 2009, yeah.
2009, that's right. Pittsburgh, September 2009, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Great. Professor Robert, I think you would like to comment something. You just raise your hand.
Yes, I would like to ask both Paulo and Alexei about their cooperation from the IMF to the World Bank, because after all, at the board of the bank, you have executive directors from the same countries. My understanding is that for whatever reason, and I'm asking you why, the people at the World Bank, your counterparts at the World Bank, have been mostly very reluctant to come in and support the BRICS as coordinated, as developed from the IMF. So what has been the relationship between the IMF people and the World Bank people?
Thank you, Robert. Perhaps let me try, and then Paulo may want to come in. I think the answer is very clear. The World Bank is very different from the IMF, needless to say that. And what they do in their board, they discuss projects, individual country projects, whether they lend to this country for this project or the other country and another project. The IMF is different in the sense that apart from lending, which is the most visible, of course, part of the IMF function, the IMF is often described as a lender of last resort and so on. But the less visible role of the IMF is that the IMF is setting the rules for the global economy and finance. And this is an area where, which is very important, by the way. The IMF is effectively determining what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. And that is a very important role of the IMF. To give you one big example is the discussion we had on what is called the institutional view on capital flows. What is the view of the IMF on capital flows? And the original document was entirely sort of a Western view on this matter. Everything needed to be liberalized. All obstacles to capital flows should have been removed, and it were the BRICS, including Paulo, myself, Rakesh Mozhin from India, and He Jianxiong from China. We really made a big change in this document by talking about dangers and risks of free flows of capital, not only advantages, which are very significant, but also risks and more specifically how these risks could be addressed, whether countries should be allowed to introduce capital controls under certain circumstances, when money, when you have money flowing out of the country and everything becomes very chaotic. So the difference between the original draft of this document and the final document was like the day and night, very different. And by the way, Brazil and India, even after all the changes made to the original draft, Brazil and India refused to support it and abstained in the last vote. Despite all my efforts to convince Paulo and the Chinese and the Indian colleague Rakesh to finally accept. So this is an example of what the fund is doing, but what is not very often noticed. Set the rules of the game. Determine what's right, what's wrong in the global economy and finance. And that's something which in the World Bank is not present. Simply, I mean, this is, in that sense, the fund and the bank are very different. And I was also, you're right. I mean, it didn't work as well in the World Bank board as it did in the IMF board. You're absolutely right, Robert. And despite all the efforts myself, Paulo, and other BRIC board members of the fund were trying to make, there was simply much less scope for coordination, cooperation in the World Bank. Well, I'm not sure that my World Bank colleagues would be happy about this description, but that's how I see it.
Would you like to add something? Yeah.
Robert, I think you made it. It's a very good question, which I think you should also, if you have the opportunity, place to executive directors at the World Bank or former executive directors at the World Bank. Because what happened was that when we started working together in the IMF in 2008, 2009, the World Bank colleagues also did a similar movement. But Robert, you're right that they never succeeded in making much of a mark, not even in the high point and the heyday of the BRICS cooperation from 2008-9 to 2014. I think partly this is due to personalities, if I may say so, because, for example, when Rakesh Mohan, the India director, left, and when Shang He left to go back to China, Alexei will recall that we had much more difficulty in maintaining our work together because the successors of these two excellent executive directors were not as active and as interested in BRICS cooperation as the previous ones, as Rakesh and He. So a lot depends on personalities, but the main thing must be structural. Because as Alexei said, we did not have ever, over all these years, the same level of cooperation in the World Bank as in the IMF. I give back the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So interesting. And we're learning things here that, well, I could never imagine. But let me change a little bit and ask one question about new development agendas. Because when I was looking yesterday at the NDB website, and the strategic movement over there is pretty much as a green bank and as an infrastructure bank. And it's written that its mandate is of mobilizing resources for infrastructure and sustainable development projects in BRICS and other emerging economies and developing countries. And so, and sometimes I would like to listen from all of you in the case. Of course, with the COP26 and so on, the green agenda is pushed forward, and we need every institution on that. However, there are other questions that appear which are new with the COVID-19. One of them, some of them change the emphasis, others are new in the game. One of them is this discussion about value changes and global outsourcing and innovative platforms and working together and having innovation putting together. And there is also this big issue about inequality, which emerged much more clear after the COVID-19. What I mean here is like development banks worked with in terms of inequalities, in terms of infrastructure, giving access, or sometimes with regional inequalities, but never worked too much. On the other hand, multilateral institutions have been since the 80s discussing inequalities like gender and racial and other stuff. And I don't see any space in the MDB so far to discuss an agenda for reducing inequalities, including access for example, for innovation and like, for example, having vaccines as a public good. So I would like to see from all of you, what could change in terms of the big agenda for a new development bank, for a development strategy, not only to have the green stocks, but if there are questions, if there are things that you could add that could help them to be together and stronger and changing the game of development for the future.
Lavinia, let me just briefly address your question. I don't want to speak too much again, because we need to open to the floor to the participants that are sending questions. But I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the New Development Bank was conceived as a bank that was to be focused, a focused bank, we were deliberately attempting to avoid the model of universal development banking followed by other existing multilateral development banks, especially the World Bank. The World Bank takes care of everything from bridges and roads to saving the Siberian tiger. And we want to be more focused. So we created a very specific but broad agenda: infrastructure and sustainable development, infrastructure and green banking. Now, this is focused but vast. And the truth is that the NDB has not been able to make a mark in these areas. So it's too early to ask the NDB to broaden its activities and to include a whole set of new issues, because it has to deliver.
Yeah,
It has first of all to deliver on what it is mandated to do by its articles of agreement, and it has not been able to do so far sufficiently to do so. So I would approach the issue in a completely different manner. Let's have the bank doing what it was supposed to do. If it does successfully infrastructure financing and green financing, it can later broaden its, as we envisage it, it can later broaden its activities to include other topics related to development.
Okay, I will return to the point. Yeah, listen to the audience. Yeah, then I will return to you.
Just one other thing. Its staff, NDB staff, is tiny. In 2017, it was 150 people. The World Bank staff is 15,000 people. So
that's right.
Yeah.
If I may, Lavinia, just a few words. We are not. I mean, I'm speaking, of course, about the International Monetary Fund, which is not the MDB. We are different, but let me just mention that we're now discussing what we call new priorities, which are 5, I believe, and which are climate, digital money, fragile and conflict-affected states, inequality and inclusiveness, and micro financial regulation. This is separate, less exciting. The thing is that, as Robert just mentioned, I mean, the NDB is tiny. The World Bank is 15,000. The IMF is something like 2.5 to 3,000 people. We do not have resources. We want to address these issues. There is a very strong pressure on us from the membership to address these issues. We have no resources for that. So what we're now discussing is that we need to augment our budget. We have kept our administrative budget flat in real terms for a decade, but now we see that we cannot cope with these new priorities without having more resources. Sorry about this intervention.
Yeah, that's great. I'm afraid we cannot do it anymore, in the sense it's even harder to be focused. It has always been, Paulo, and it's even harder in the post-COVID world without talking. I mean, everyone demands you to take care about the 17 objectives of social development goals. But I understand your point of view, and I would like you to explore why the projects did not succeed. It is a lack of projects. It is a problem of risk. And so when you finish that, I will pass it. We have a question from the floor as well. So just very briefly, if you could comment why the projects did not launch. Was it exchange rate risk? Was it lack of good projects, governance, determination, in your point of view, please?
Well, I tried already to explain a little bit the reasons why the NDB failed to live up to expectations in my initial presentation, and I do so at length in the book. It's not specific issues like exchange rate risk. No, not lack of projects. I think it's mainly an organizational and governance issue. associated to macro political factors that hampered the bank, So if you have a weak administration, like we did since the very beginning, with political problems arising from the countries, conflicts between India and China, difficulties of Russia after the 2014 crisis, Brazil's lack of presence after the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, all this created a package of influences that hampered the bank in living up to the expectations. But again, I want to stress, despite all this, the bank is there. Its staff is still small, but it has increased. The governance of the bank has been established in detail. The policies have been worked out. Projects have been approved, not as many as we wished, but they're there. The bank approved, including large program loans for COVID combating purposes in the 5 countries last year and this year. So the bank is there, it's working. And I do believe that if the political momentum is returned to the BRICS, and I hope this can happen as soon as 2023 with the contribution of Brazil, I'm sure that the bank will take off again and will gradually become one of the most relevant multilateral development banks in the world.
Você está sem som. Você está sem som.
Okay, I'm looking to the chat now, and there are some comments. And maybe Rogério Student is here, who was at the World Bank, and maybe he wants to say something. It's a question. I didn't understand if this is a question or a comment he made on the chat. But it's...
Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure.
No, I want you just to clarify. First of all, very great to see you, Paulo, again, and see you, Alexei, and see Robert. I was in another meeting. I could not join you, and it's Thanksgiving here, but I wanted so much to see you again. And Lavinia, thank you very much for organizing this, that I decided to jump in. Exactly at the moment there was a discussion about the role of the World Bank board. I did have a different perspective view of the issue. As you probably remember, I represented Brazil at the time at the World Bank. The BRICS executive director were very, very cooperated very closely. We had, particularly in the, can you hear me still?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Particularly in the aftermath of the crisis, when we had to, there was a lot of work, a lot of pressure on putting things together. But there was this very open discussion about voice and representation, which had to do with the governance of the World Bank and the multilateral institutions. And part of that discussion ended up through the work of the World Bank colleagues, for instance, in the decision to launch for the first time a candidacy for the president of the World Bank.
Yes.
There was, at the time, you have to understand, coming at the IMF, that would have been an impossible discussion. And it was only possible because colleagues from Russia, India, South Africa, and China worked together through the G11, which at the time I chaired. I had the pleasure to chair the G11, which was the grouping that represented the chairs with most developing countries, or all the developing countries in the bank. It was only possible to achieve because we worked together. And that was not only that. Of course, the IMF colleagues had very incredible contributions in these discussions and leading the discussions on the institutions, the new development bank, and also all the institutions in the that associated with BRICS. But I remember clearly having very lengthy discussions through the night sometime about the mandate of the new development bank, and particularly the issue of sustainable development, which in a way we made very clear that should be the mandate at the new development bank. And I was extremely thrilled when I saw that happening. it's interesting because at the World Bank, even before the discussions of the new development bank, there was a discussion of the need to make sustainable development the anchor, the main mandate, because of the three pillars that were so critical for us, and governance, the joint actions of the BRICS directors. So of course, there was a significant leadership of particularly Paulo and Alexei here and other colleagues from BRICS Bank, but I respectfully disagree with this view that the World Bank board, the BRICS colleagues were not coordinated and were not influential in this discussion. And for me, I have to say it was not just an honor to have represented one of the BRICS countries, but to be able to say here in front of you that we achieved, for instance, a discussion of the governance at the level of presenting for the first time, a candidate for presidency of the institution. I think I had to make justice to my colleagues at the World Bank. But once again, Robert, Paulo, Alexei, and Lavinia, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and happy Thanksgivings for those who are around here or passing by, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rogério. Just I think for the final minutes, I think we have a question here from Bruno De Conti from the audience. Do you know if the idea of BRIC credit rating agency is moving ahead? How do you see this initiative?
Bruno Conti, Lavinia, Bruno Conti is a professor at Unicamp who studies these issues very much. He is right to raise this issue. The BRICS credit rating agency was on the table for some time, but we never managed to add. I haven't heard of it in recent times. I believe the issue is more or less dormant and has not has not reached successful conclusion so far.
I have nothing to add to what Paulo said. I know about this initiative, but I think the word the word dormant is unfortunately the right word to describe it.
Okay, so I would like to ask each of us to final words. So we are reaching our time. So we still have like 10 minutes. And so we'll give the floor first for, let's follow the same order. So please, Paulo Nogueira, for your final thoughts, and then we move on the same order. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavinia. Let me explain. I forgot to mention at the beginning of my talk, I intended to do so, but forgot why I was speaking in English. In Brazil, an event held in Brazil, with a largely or mostly Brazilian audience. The reason why I was not speaking in Portuguese was that the organizers, the translators, asked me not to introduce a second language. This would complicate their life. But I would have preferred to speak in Portuguese and have my intervention translated to English. It's a pity. But anyway, I'd like to again thank Lavinia, and especially Robert Wade and Aleksei Mozhin. And I would like to draw the attention of those that are listening to us, the Brazilians in particular, to the fact that we have had the privilege here of listening to the participation, to the interventions of people who are outstanding in this field, who have an enormous contribution, not only theoretical, but in the case of Alexei, also practical. So if you ever want to know, the famous question, what do you want to know about the MF, but we're afraid to ask? The person to address the question to is certainly Alexei, because of his long experience and intelligence. And Robert Wade, I've been learning from Robert Wade's writings and interventions since the 1990s. I was very happy that he could accept our invitation to be here today, and I look forward to remaining in touch with Robert and Alexei for the future. Thank you.
So please, Robert, wait for a second.
Okay, so let me just say I was very glad to hear Rogerio talk because I have been puzzled. The point is that there were very similar governance issues in the World Bank to those in the fund. And as Paulo's book makes very clear, one of the main stimuluses to this whole BRICS initiative in the fund was the gross underrepresentation, the lack of influence of developing countries in the fund. But the same was true in the World Bank. And people were mobilizing in the World Bank, to my knowledge, to change the position of developing countries inside the World Bank. And so I was really puzzled by what Paulo said, and especially what Alexei said, that there was very little communication. I mean, we're talking about two organizations which are about 20 meters apart, one from another, on the other side, on the two sides of 19th Street in Washington. How could it be that representatives from the BRICS countries facing exactly the same governance issues could not be highly coordinating amongst themselves? So I was actually quite doubtful about Alexei's interpretation, and I'm glad that Rogerio came in to give a counterbalance. That's it. Thanks.
Please, Dr. Alexei.
Okay, let me first address this issue of World Bank cooperation. I mean, of course, yes, I don't think there is much of a disagreement. It is certainly clear that governance issues in the fund and in the World Bank are very similar. And I recollect the efforts and the contribution of our World Bank colleagues in attempting at least to address governance issues in the World Bank, like me and Paulo and our other Indian Chinese colleagues in the fund were doing. So I'm not questioning this, and it is very unfortunate that so far we have not been able to achieve too much in terms of the governance reform. Although I mentioned many times in to different audiences that the very emergence of the BRICS, I see it as the biggest governance reform or governance change in the two Bretton Woods institutions. The point which I made was about issues other than governance. In the fund, there is this unique role of the fund of determining the rules of the game in the international finance and global economy. The World Bank doesn't have this role to the same extent. So what I was trying to explain, that the scope for cooperation between the 4 and then 5 BRICS countries in the fund was perhaps somewhat larger than in the World Bank. But in no way did I mean to be critical of the World Bank colleagues. And of course, on the governance matters, they have done everything that we have done in the fund, or in terms of attempting to make a change. So that's on this subject, and many thanks to Rogerio for making this point. I think it was a very fair point and very good intervention. But if that's our final word, I would certainly want to thank the organizers, Lavinia, Paulo, Robert, I think this was a very good discussion. I was glad to participate in it. Of course, this whole discussion was prompted by the publication of the new book, and it is the Paulo's book which I think was in the center of our discussion, and rightly so. So thank you very much. I was, as I said, very glad to participate.
Thank you very much for all of you, all attendants. They are listening to us. I would like to say that I like the book very much. It's very well written, and then you read like fast, and sometimes you say to yourself, "I can't believe he said so," because I'm a public servant and I would never say many things he said. But I mean, he's very correct, and it's very interesting because explain things that really happens in those negotiations, and also give some hope. I think we should. There is an expression in Brazil that says "complexo de vira-lata," which is a complex of inferiority, a mud complex. And we should be bold and then understand that we are huge economies and we can change the floor. I mean, it's more than time for doing it. And so thank you very much, all of you, for your participations, and hope to see you next time. Thank you. Bye.
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 Bye. We'll be in touch. We'll be in touch.
We'll be in touch, yeah.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Para terminar a gravação, por favor.